Tonight we come to specific classes of demons mentioned in the Old Testament. There are no classes of demons mentioned in the New, but there are in the Old. First, Seirim. It's Seirim, Seirim. And Sa'ir is the singular, of course. The Seirim is to be translated demon, satyr, or he-goat. Now, this particular class of demons were worshipped and sacrificed to, propitiated in the Old Testament. We see this in the pre-Mosaic period from Leviticus 17:7 and Deuteronomy 32:16 and 17. Those are texts I gave you last time. I'll read the first one to you. Leviticus 17:7. They shall no more offer their sacrifices unto devils, the King James says. Demons, literally, but the Hebrew term is a sa'ir. The practice of the worship of this particular class of demons was revived according to 2 Chronicles 11:15. Then the goat, in the third place, is very prominent in occultism. Well, why? Because it's a class of demons. And Satan himself often appears as a he-goat in the Black Sabbats and so forth. He actually appears as a he-goat. I don't mean a vision of him, but he actually has chosen to appear that way. He has and still does receive worship by the witches as a goat. You'll see the head and features of a goat very prominent in all the occult yet today. If you go into a bookstore and look in the occult section, not that you need to be there, I'm just making a point, you'll see a number of the books will have pictures of goat heads who look like the devil more than a goat on there. And the devil, when he appears, often appears with 3 horns instead of 2. In witchcraft, literal goats have been and are trained to have sex with humans, with the witches. Now, it doesn't matter because some little naive witch may not know that goes on. She should study the history of witchcraft. And it does go on. Because it symbolizes the devil. And then we've already pointed out the Mosaic prohibitions against bestiality in Leviticus 20, verses 15 and 16, which, of course, was striking at this sort of witchcraft, because it's always been practiced. Now, some of the people I've counseled with, the demons appear to them in animal form. And like one individual was frightened because the appearance of the demons to her, for the purpose of gratifying their lust, were as men with animal heads, like goat heads and fox heads and so forth. Animal worship and the prominence of animals in occultism, you see, is with us yet today, but here's where you get the understanding from the Old Testament. Then in astrology, the goat is the 10th sign of the zodiac, Capricorn. So that ought to tell you something about the significance of the goat in occultism if you didn't know anything else. The 10th sign was considered by the ancients the most important of the 12 because it represents the devil. Then a second class of demons in the Old Testament mentioned by classification, which, as I say, is unusual because that doesn't happen in the New Testament, are the Shadim. Shedim, Shadim. And it's translated demon. It comes from a root which means mighty one, or a root which means to devastate or ruin. In Aramaic and Arabic, it means the same thing. The other languages which are akin to Hebrew. The Israelites were told sacrifice to the Shadim in Deuteronomy 32:17 and in Psalm 106:37. We looked both of those up last time also, so we'll not take time again. You wouldn't see that in English. They've got the craziest translations like screech owls and night monsters and all that. So I always, when I teach this, have to go back to the Hebrew because NASV, ASV, RSV, King James, you'll get 4 different meanings for all these words. Don't ever try to read Deuteronomy 18 out of the English. It just won't help you. You need to go to the Hebrew. In occultism, this demon always appears with claws like a rooster. The demon may have an animal form, but they appear with feet as claws as a rooster. Another, Lilith, The Lelit is a female night demon. It's the Babylonian Lilitu, L-I-L-I-T-U. We mentioned Babylonian and Syriac and Arabic and Aramaic. Remember, these are all cognate languages. That is, they all come from the same family. Many times the Bible may only mention a term, then you go into the Aramaic and Babylonian excavations and their records and histories. Well, you'll find that same root in Aramaic and you'll see it's used in the same connection, but it may be in a text that'll give the whole explanation of what the word means. Anyway, King James doesn't help much on this. It's screech owl. But there's absolutely no basis for that. Absolutely zero. By any stretch of the imagination. If you couldn't read Hebrew and you had 10,000 choices, and this was one of them, and you threw it up, it'd come down last. Threw all of them up and said, I'll pick the first one comes down. Screech owl would come down last. That's how far away it is from the meaning. I mean, you can't believe it when you translate Greek and Hebrew many times, where they got their translations. Well, in Jewish folklore, Lilith was Adam's first wife before Eve. Not tradition, this is folklore. Adam's first wife before Eve, and the offspring of that marriage was the origin of the demons. But in Jewish thought, as well as occult thought, she is the female demon who seduces men at night. Now that isn't far-fetched, because in fact there are certain demons who are not male or female, because like the angels, I assume the demons are the same. Jesus said the angels neither marry nor given in marriage. But there are certain demons who take on certain characteristics. Certain demons prey on men, certain demons prey on women. Now, I've counseled with any number of people where this is an actual fact, where they've been attacked and sometimes seduced. I always use the word seduced with quotes. That's the term they use. I was seduced by a demon. But occult history is filled with this sort of fact. Now, when I first got into the occult studies for the purpose of deliverance of people and so on, I ran into this in history. Then people, once they saw you had that ministry, they started coming to you. And everything from nuns, literally, nuns practicing yoga, or a housewife or whatever. Men and women both have been subjected to these attacks. They're real. Because if you know anything about the occult, anyone who ever has attended a genuine seance can see demons materialize, and they can take on forms and feelings. You can't tell it's not a human. The fleshly feeling, the heartbeat. These are facts. What do you think all these people are seeing when they see the flying saucers and the creatures of the third kind? Everything from, Bigfoot, who stinks like the toilet, literally, worse, to humanoid creatures that have come to keep us from blowing ourselves up. And they never can catch a creature or a flying saucer or anything, because you see these are demonic manifestations of the supernatural. You could touch it, it would feel like metal, the saucer. And many people have been in them, no question. But they materialize as they want to, and it's all a part of the end-time deception, you see. Satan has deluded millions. Well, they love not the knowledge of the truth, and now God sends them strong delusion that they'll believe a lie. So they believe these are creatures from other planets coming to help us, and they select you as a candidate to spread their message when the time comes. But demons don't always have to materialize to be able to take on the functions of a person with a body. Because some that I've counseled with couldn't see anything, but all of the shape and things they could feel when they were being attacked was a man or a woman. But sometimes they do materialize. You read the history of occultism or the history of the church, you'll find some of the, we'll call them saints, who fled to the desert to get more holy because the world was sinful. There are many accounts of these saints, quote unquote, we're all saints, if we're in Christ, being attempted to be seduced by ravishing, beautiful women who would appear to them. And they were literal demonic manifestations. Well, I don't want to dwell on this, but read every wind of doctrine under incubus and succubus. The incubus is a demon who takes on the characteristics of the male gender and attacks women. or tries to. And remember, these are demons of lust. People have them. Actually, in this body, I don't mean since we've been over here, but in this very body I have delivered people who have been attacked by creatures like this. They don't imagine it. And succubus is the demon that takes on female characteristics and attacks or seduces men. Now, as I say, it doesn't mean the demons have gender, sex, male or female. I'm sure, as far as I'm concerned, that isn't true any more than of angels. But I would assume the same demon could manifest either way. But there's some, like Lilith, that is always female. Lilith. And the name is common today among people, as I say, who are involved in the occult. It's not some Old Testament word. She's still around, is what I'm saying. In Canada, I delivered the worst case I've ever seen of demon possession, as far as the person being totally possessed once I laid hands on his head to deliver him. And when the controlling spirit began to manifest, he took on all the characteristics and gestures and voice of a woman. Literally. A big husky fellow. But I immediately was talking to a female spirit, or a spirit with female characteristics. And her name was Jezebel. But I wouldn't have needed the feminine name to know it was a feminine spirit. In fact, it's so queer and odd when you see the complete change. Like, pray for the deliverance of a 5-year-old child, and a male voice starts talking out of its vocal cords. Well, right away, you know you're dealing with something demonic. Unusually demonic, I mean. Lilith is mentioned in Isaiah 34:14 as the demon who will haunt desolated Edom. God's going to punish Edom, make her desolate, and to show his utter contempt for her, he's going to allow Lilith to occupy the ruins. Remember last week we showed you the habitat of demons. One of the places are the ruins of ancient cultures and civilizations. I suppose you could find them around ghost towns in the West because there was nothing there but crime and carousing. They had 20 saloons. Every other house was a red light district, and generally no church, not even, a semblance of one. Now this demon is so prominent in occultism from way back that she is included in the Bible, in the scriptures. That's the one with the name, Lilith. And she still works. Of course, there are many demons with the female characteristics who try to seduce men and attack them, and sometimes it's in the dreams, you see. So people who are not careful can be attacked because they're not under the blood, or they're not walking in the light or in fellowship, or whatever. That brings us to Spiritism. Spiritism. The text is Deuteronomy 18:9-14, which we will proceed to read. We deal with this, have dealt with it many, many times concerning occultism. But as you can see, there are many, many passages in the Bible that deal with the occult besides this. Deuteronomy 18. I'm going to read the translation that I give out of my book, Every Wind of Doctrine, because there I give some contemporary meanings of the terms. But you can look at your version, it'll read similar. It's the latter part of verse 9. Thou shalt not learn to do after the abomination of those nations. There shall not be found with thee anyone that uses divination. And we have in parentheses here, fortune telling. But of course, divination can include any kind of seeking to know unknown facts, whether it's fortune telling or, a water witcher is a diviner, you see. It's called a divining rod. There shall not be anyone that uses divination, fortune telling, or an observer of the times, a soothsayer, or an enchanter, a magician, or a witch, a sorcerer or sorceress, or a charmer, a hypnotist, or a consulter with familiar spirits, a medium possessed with a spirit guide, or a wizard, a clairvoyant, or a psychic, or a necromancer, a medium who consults the dead. For all that do these things are an abomination to the Lord. Now it's one thing to be an abomination to us, or your neighbor, it's another thing to be an abomination to the Lord. Now, Spiritism is the modern-day term for the various practices described in the Old Testament that we just read. Spiritism is the modern-day term for these various practices, such as sorcery, divination, soothsaying, astrology, consulting the dead, and all. And man has always been fascinated by the idea of being able to uncover the secrets of the hidden world, the hidden or spiritual realm, and of seeing into the unknown future. It's just human nature. It fascinates him. And Satan, of course, has always been ready to supply substitutes for true religion and the revelation of the Word of God. Now, to avoid confusion, you might want to write this down. To avoid confusion, keep in mind that some occult functions will overlap that we'll discuss. Just like they do today. For example, a fortune teller can also be a palm reader, you see. A water witcher may also be a psychometrist, which means that he can hold somebody's ring or handkerchief or shoe and tell you things about them. Our missing person, an article of clothing, a psychometrist can touch it and he will know whether the person's dead or alive. And if he's real good, real powerful, he's not good, but real powerful, he can take a map and douse the map then. That'll be the second step. Give the exact location where the body can be found in a pond or whatever. So to avoid confusion, remember, terms will overlap because some of you invariably are going to say, what about this or what about that? If you'll keep that in mind, it'll help you. Well, let's come first of all to sorcery. Now, the King James Version translates the term witchcraft. The term sorcery, they translate witchcraft. But the Hebrew is what I gave you, sorcery. The term is keshef. Keshef. K-E-S-H-E-P-H. Keshef. That's sorcery, and the same term practically means a sorcerer or a sorceress. A kashaf. Kashaf. A sorcerer or sorceress. See, witchcraft or witch is an English term, so obviously we're not helped much. And when you figure a witch can be a male or female, that even becomes more confusing. But a sorcerer can't be a sorceress, obviously. Now, the forms in Arabic and Syriac, this same form means to cut and to pray. Like many English words have different meanings. To cut doubtless referred to disfiguring one's body with knives and needles and so forth, like you still see in pagan worship and some forms of occultism. To cut. And the idea to pray would be communication with the demons. They worship them. So we're just throwing that in because kashaf, sorcery, doesn't tell you much. But when you know the root meanings, it helps you to see why they select the words, helps you to understand the subject better. Let's deal with the word witch because that's the one everyone uses, even though it means sorcerer or sorcery. The term witch can be male or female. If it's female, it's witch, and if it's male, it's witch. But if you're technical, the female now has come to mean witch, and the male witch is a warlock. Warlock, W-A-R-L-O-C-K. The male witch is a warlock. But what do you think of when you hear the term or read the term witch or witchcraft? Everyone immediately thinks of a woman. Wonder why? Well, it's because sorcery has always been largely carried on by the female sex. That's why. Still is. The King James Version translates it, instead of sorceress of Endor, the witch of Endor. But see, a witch could be a male or a female. But witch has taken on the meaning of a woman. You know, that old witch, or she bewitched him. But witch doesn't tell you anything about sex or gender. The witches' coven, and they're all over today. You might even have them in Warsaw and North Webster, for all you know. The witches' covens are headed by a high priestess. Much more so than a male warlock, although sometimes a coven will have both, the high priest and high priestess. But it's the high priestess that leads. She's really the powerful one in a coven. And the significance of the emphasis upon sorceresses, the significance of the emphasis upon the female is the concept of fertility in witchcraft. See, there we're back using the term again. The concept of fertility in witchcraft. The concept of the mother goddess predominates in witchcraft. It's prominent in all occultism, even yet today. Always has been. And so a witch is thought of as a woman because most of them are. Take your fortune teller. How many male or men fortune tellers do you know or know of or ever heard of? They're very rare. The medium at a seance, most of the time is a woman. Palm readers. You see the sign on the highway? You don't think of a man because it isn't. It's Laverne, Madame Laverne, or whatever. Irene, Madame Irene. You never hear Mr. Bob or whatever. It's always a woman. Card readers are women. Crystal ball gazers are women. Now in occult that isn't necessarily so because water diviners are generally men, although women sometimes have the power. And astrologers through history have generally been men. I don't have any footnotes for this. It's just from study. I'm sure if you'd check, most astrologers have been men, but today it's probably about evenly divided. Now the nature of sorcery in the Old Testament next. The nature of sorcery. Well, there are certain characteristics is what I'm talking about. First of all, we see that sorceress or a sorcerer consult the dead. The sorceress at Endor, 1 Samuel 28. Sorceress of Endor. They practice magic. We're talking about the Old Testament. Exodus 7:11, the sorcerers of Egypt practice magic. They interpret dreams, still do. Daniel 2:2. They practice divination, that is, predicting the future. Jeremiah 27:9 and 10. Then, as throughout occult history, there is the implied use of drugs by sorcerers in the Old Testament. See, it's a fact that drugs have always had a prominent place in any form of occultism, and especially in sorcery, because it's used for various purposes. Now, there's nowhere in the Old Testament that you have a verse that says sorcerers and their drugs and so forth are to be avoided. But you know from the study of sorcery and occultism that drugs play a prominent part, always have and still do. But we have strong evidence of this fact anyway from an indirect way. The Septuagint gives evidence that drug usage was a part of Old Testament sorcery. The Septuagint translates the word for sorcery with, guess what? Pharmacy. Drugs. Pharmakeia. 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 Which means pharmacy. Anyone who can add two and two can start putting things together. Why God has the opinion he does about Christians who run to doctors and take medicine. Yeah. Galatians 5:20 uses the term in the New Testament, pharmakeia. Remember, the Septuagint is the same Greek as the New Testament. It uses the term pharmakeia in Galatians 5:20, and there they translate it back to the Hebrew meaning of sorcery. in the NASV. See, sorcery is translated in the Septuagint pharmakai, meaning pharmacy, drugs, use of drugs and so forth. And in the New Testament, when they use that word, they translate it back into the Hebrew meaning sorcery. Well, occultists still use drugs. I keep up fairly well with this field because, well, people are constantly writing you, and you have to keep up if that's part of your ministry. But drugs are still a part of the ritual of occultism, sorcery. Sometimes it's taken internally as a part of the ritual and to heighten the sexual drive, because regardless of what anyone thinks, that's a large part of present-day witchcraft. And then there's the magical use of drugs to ward off evil, to ensure fertility, or to get someone to love you. You know, you go through the magical ritual, and sometimes drugs will be a part of that. You give somebody something to drink that you want to love you or whatever, with this potion in it. Now, as we suggested, medical science has its origins in witchcraft. If we didn't say it before, we're saying it now, but I implied it in previous statements. Has its origins in witchcraft, witch doctors. And anyone who has any question about that or interest in it, just get some good encyclopedias and go to any good library and start making a research, and you'll discover why you see that serpent on a staff. That isn't the same one that's Numbers Moses lifted up by any means. No, this is the symbol of the pagan god who healed by magical means and sorcery. And the significance is, though, we're coming to that, medical science comes directly, not indirectly, directly out of witchcraft, and they still are pharmacists. That is to say, they still make the same use of drugs for both mental and physical ills, same as originally. And they use hypnosis, which comes right out of witchcraft. Drugs and hypnosis are just two of the ways that show the source of this. This is why you don't see remedies and drugs and physicians in Israel. Never. Or the church, for that matter. I mean the church in the New Testament. And that's why it's not just a lack of faith for you to say, well, it was a real trial and I just couldn't hold out, and it was my child or my wife or husband. That's why it's not just a lack of faith. When you go to a doctor and take his drugs, it's a lack of discernment as to the source of where you're getting your treatment. And I say it without hesitation. Anybody that has ever and whenever takes treatments through that sort of method needs to go through occult deliverance. Some of you have gone through occult deliverance, I guess, for everything in the world, and still things are not working out. Maybe it's because you opened yourself to a witchcraft demon through that source. That's no small thing. It's not just a lack of faith. That's why God hates people who turn away from Him to the arm of the flesh. That's why He says, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his arm. Blessed is the man whose trust is in the Lord. Why do you suppose He put all those promises about healing in both Old and New Testament? It's an abomination to God for you to go for medical treatment. You should go through occult deliverance. And not for me to take you through it. Take yourself through it. You open the door, you close it. I mean, this is just a little bit bigger than some of you are probably ready to handle yet. You are the ones who should go to the library and make your own research. I recognize people go to the library and make research like some have on Christmas and Easter, and those pagan celebrations, and they'll end up, well, I don't see anything wrong with it. I don't worship the tree, and I don't believe in Santa Claus. So you can cop out that way. Say, well, doctors today are not involved in witchcraft. Well, let's see. I believe it's in Angels of Light where I deal with that. You'd be surprised how many use the pendulum to diagnose your illness. I've dealt with people who have. Dr. Wright in Ohio, he'll come and tell you himself until he heard me teaching on deliverance from occult involvement. Why, he said in our clinic, it's common for us to diagnose with the pendulum. And when we don't know what drug to treat it with, we go back and we use the pendulum over the whole stock of drugs. And wherever it starts swinging in a circle, that's the one we give them, and it helps them. Yeah, it helps them temporarily. That is not unusual. I don't mean every doctor does, but I'm saying the craft comes out of witchcraft. Drugs in your body as a Christian? God didn't design your body for witchcraft potions and mutilation with a scalpel. Well, things ought to be a little obvious, but they're not obvious. If they were, why, we'd all be translated already. We'd just be ready to go. And that's why turning to man is not just a lack of faith, but you're turning to occult sources. You don't know the effect that drugs have on you, and anybody, no one can even debate the point for one instant. Anything from an aspirin up or down has adverse effects. It's common knowledge that aspirins cause internal bleeding. One aspirin. And all of these things that result in one's later life, how do you know what you opened yourself to? Just by taking a drug. You see, people who get on drug trips, many of them are the same drugs. Uppers and downers and all of those things. Many are the same drugs that you can buy in a drugstore to go to sleep or stay awake, to rest you, to ease pain or whatever. And they have these demonic trips and lose their minds and become human vegetables. Open themselves to all sorts of fanciful things in the demonic realm. Well, then, why do you think you're immune? The devil isn't going to broadcast or announce his presence because you're on Dristan or something. Well, he will manifest himself generally according to the receptivity of the person. If you want it raw, the way it is, just naked black magic, he'll give you that in all of its filth and degradation and awfulness. But if you just want to be separated from God for eternity, but want religion, then he'll give you the white magic sort of witch's coven to join or something. Well, anyway, or sell you a Ouija board for Christmas through Sears and Roebuck. Pharmakia. That's interesting, isn't it? You ought to think of that next time you walk in a drugstore. I didn't say you couldn't walk in a drugstore. Did anybody hear me say that? I'll tell you, it would be another thing, as far as I'm concerned, to work in one. You might think of that when you're listening to the tape on Christian vocation and calling. There's some places Christians shouldn't work. Even though the devil will tell you you're helping humanity. Yeah, helping humanity destroy itself. That's sorcery. Now we come to divination in the Old Testament. Terms here. Hebrew term for divination is kesem. It's Q-E-S-E-M. Kesem. Divination. Kosem is the participle, which is a diviner. A kosem is a diviner. The original meaning is to divide. The verb to divide. Now we recognize there can be other meanings to words, divide, distribute, and so forth, but for our purposes we show the occult connection. It means to divide. Well, what's the connection between the root to divide something up and a diviner? Well, here no doubt we have the idea of the astrologer who divides the heavens up into 12 equal sections, and we have the signs of the zodiac. And then he divines and predicts on the basis of the relationship of the stars and the planets within that particular constellation. Well, that's just common knowledge about astrology that you ought to already know, but the reason a diviner is a kosem and the verb means to divide, no doubt, is that connection, dividing the heavens up. Now, divination is a more comprehensive term than astrology. even though dividing the heavens up by an astrologer is the root meaning of the word, suggests that. Yet divination is the more comprehensive term than astrology. A diviner is not merely an astrologer, we're saying. An astrologer will divine. Divine means predict, foretell. So while an astrologer does that with his horoscopes and charts and predicts historical events, and most rulers have always had their astrologers. That includes contemporary ones. Hitler had his. Living leaders today have theirs. Presidents of this country have had theirs. That's why they made some of the fumbles they made. You better believe it, because they're following the astrologers and not God. But divination is the broader term. It includes astrology, or an astrologer, a psychometrist, a palm reader, water diviner, so on. Divining any way you can divine, from a Ouija board to astrology, everything in between. Anything that predicts or foretells the future would be divination. That's what the word means with respect to practice, the practice of foretelling. Now, in the Old Testament, the diviner was a soothsayer, false prophet, fortune teller, who predicted the future. Be a soothsayer, sorcerer, false prophet, fortune teller who predict the future. The diviner looked for signs of future events, as to the outcome of future events, in various ways. He would look in the intros of sacrificed animals. And the way they looked, he was trained, you see, in divining by looking at the intros of an animal. Or the flight of birds. There's many ways to divine in occultism as there are words in the dictionary. The flight of birds. Another way is reading the signs in a cup. Of course, that today is obviously coffee grounds and tea leaves. But there are many other ways to read in a cup. You can break an egg on water, and just many, many ways. The water becomes a crystal ball, or the egg will take on the form of the event or demon or whatever, right on the egg yolk. Divining by a cup, the way arrows would fall to the ground when they were cast is another way. You see many of these right in the Old Testament. Consulting the teraphim, Teraphim. Consulting the teraphim. And by the inspection of animal livers. Now Nebuchadnezzar used three of these methods in Ezekiel 21:21. He used arrows, teraphim, and livers. The practice of consulting the liver was so widespread that excavations in the Near East have uncovered clay models of divination livers. The Philistines had their diviners, according to 1 Samuel 6:2. The witch of Endor was told to divine. That's what she was called upon to do by Saul, 1 Samuel 28. It was common among the Canaanites and condemned by God, divination. Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 and 14. It's mentioned many places in the Bible, so you could probably look it up in a concordance. Divination was quite prominent in Old Testament practice. That is, the Old Testament world. There is a passage I'd like for you to turn to, and that's in Genesis 44, where we see what is a bit of a problem with some people. And that is, Joseph is said here to have had a divining cup. I assume you know the account where the brethren sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt. Many years pass after he's been imprisoned in Egypt and all. A famine throughout the world, a dream he interpreted of Pharaoh told them this. Egypt has stored up grain for 7 good years, and it's a 7-year famine. So Jacob sends his sons down to Egypt to buy grain, and there they're confronted with Joseph, but they don't recognize him. And one way he ensnares them so he'll get them all down there is he tells his servant to put a cup in one of the bags where they bought grain and put their money back in. All right. That cup is called a divining cup. He commanded his steward, the steward of his house, saying, "Fill the men's sack with food as much as they can carry, and put every man's money in his sack mouth, and put my cup, the silver cup, in the sack's mouth of the youngest with his grain money." And he did according to the word that Joseph had spoken. And as soon as the morning was light, the men were sent away, they and their asses. And when they were gone out of the city, and not yet far off, Joseph said unto his steward, "Up, follow after the men, and when thou dost overtake them, say unto them, Wherefore have ye rewarded evil for good? Is not this it in which my Lord drinketh, and whereby indeed he divineth?" People have a problem with that. He says, "You've done evil in so doing." So he overtook them and spake unto them these same words. And they said unto him, "Wherefore saith my Lord these words? God forbid that thy servants should do according to this thing." Then over in verse 15, after they were returned to Joseph's presence, Joseph said to them, "What deed is this that you have done? Know ye not that such a man as I can certainly divine?" Well, and so people say, Joseph had a divining cup? Joseph, the one who's such a model and ran away from that woman and had all those wonderful dreams about how God was going to use him? Well, how do we explain this? First of all, doubtless the obvious thing, if you just sit before a text for a moment, the obvious thing would occur to you that he's doing this to confuse the brothers by having his servant suggests that it was used for that purpose. Why would he do that? Because every ruler had a divining cup. Now there again, you'll have to do your own independent study. Every ruler had a divining cup, just as Nebuchadnezzar in Ezekiel 21:21 we're told used many forms of divination, like looking in the liver. See, he could do that, as well as he'd have his own diviners who would do it. So it would be the most valued possession of a ruler, and a very serious crime for anybody to take it. What could they have stolen and gotten out of Egypt? Because they couldn't carry out his gold bed, which he no doubt had, or his Cadillac or whatever, his chariot. But the most valued possession, a ruler, and all rulers divined in cups and had diviners who could divine in their personal cups. That would be his most valued possession, more than even his golden throne. That's the point here, because when Joseph became second ruler of Egypt, why, he would get all of the things. It doesn't mean he used them. He'd get all the things that any ruler would have. One would be a divining cup. That's a possibility. The other obvious thing is that he's just doing that to confuse his brothers, because Joseph himself says over and over that he got his revelations direct from the Lord. You read the many chapters of the Joseph accounts, and you'll see that he says he gets his predictions, his interpretation of dreams, and he would always say, "The Lord gives those to me." When he was in Palestine, when he was in jail and interpreted dreams, when he interpreted the dreams to Pharaoh, he never once ever mentions having to say, "Well, wait until I go into a trance or get my divining cup." You see. Of course, it's completely out of harmony with the whole Old Testament teaching to think Joseph literally used it. I'm just suggesting ways in which there are obvious answers. But in the final analysis, it doesn't matter how someone wants to interpret this passage. Deuteronomy 18 clearly condemns the practice. So that's what we need to end up with, what God's view is. I don't have any trouble with the passage. I can see Joseph just using that as a guise the way he did other things with respect to his brothers until he revealed himself to them. And that would be the most vicious crime they could commit. They could not think of anything that would be a greater crime against a ruler than to take his means of getting revelation. And it would be convenient, as I say, to put it in a sack. Then we come to necromancer. Translated sometimes in the English as familiar spirit. Familiar spirit. The English term necromancer is from nekros mantia. Nekros in Greek is a dead body. Mantia is the word for divination. And so, a necromancer means a medium who consults the dead. Two words, nekros mantia, meaning divination, dead body divination. Well, again, you wonder where they dig up the terms in English. The Hebrew term is ov. Ov. It's O-B with the soft sound, of course, ov, which means a bottle. A medium who consults the dead is called a bottle, means an empty bottle. And derived meaning is a consulter with the dead, or a necromancer, if you're going to use Greek terminology. But the Hebrew is an ov. Why a bottle? Well, it's not as hard to figure out as you might think. First of all, the concept of a necromancer being a bottle, or called a bottle, an ov, is perhaps a reference to the hollow, haunting sound that the wind or one's breath makes in an empty bottle. You ever blown in an empty bottle? That haunting sound and the hollow, haunting, disembodied sound of demons speaking through trumpets in seances and the vocal cords of a medium who's in a trance. You get very weird sounds in seances. Hollow sound. Well, do you know why the trumpets are quite prominent in seances? A trumpet, a literal trumpet, like at a ball game. And they make trumpets, and they'll have trumpets, that is a horn, hollow tube, bigger at one end, at seances. Because the demons who, when they come into the physical realm, have to have a vocal apparatus. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to speak. To speak, you've got to have somebody's vocal apparatus. That's why the medium goes into a trance, so the demon can use their vocal cords. Now, powerful spirits can create their own vocal cords. This, again, is common knowledge in occultism. But they have to have something to magnify their voice, to speak through. And it gets a hollow sound. And of course, that wouldn't be something new to the 20th century. The very fact that the medium is called an ov, a bottle, you see the connection. And when the demons don't show, you've heard of no-shows? Sometimes they don't show up at seances. So many, many mediums are good ventriloquists. They can throw their voice. So they do that. So dead mother's over there in the corner. She can't appear tonight for some reason as far as being visible, but she can speak. So the medium speaks for the demon, impersonates the dead person. Now that's not an arbitrary suggestion, because we come back to the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, and guess what word they translate ov with in the Greek? Ventriloquist. Oh, I'll tell you, it'd pay you to study the Septuagint along with the Bible, which is what I had to do, you see, to teach Old Testament theology, because sometimes you couldn't even find meanings of words, and then you come to the Septuagint and see what they thought about it. Because these are Jewish scholars who know both Greek and Hebrew perfectly. See, when they got to the passage in the Bible, it said, don't consult oaths, translated necromancers or people with familiar spirits, but in the Hebrew it's just an oath, a bottle. Don't consult the bottles, literally is what it said. They translated that as a ventriloquist. Because, you see, ventriloquism would have been practiced back from the beginning in occultism. You might, by the way, just in parenthesis somewhere, keep in mind the danger or the subtle danger of the children's television programs that try to teach them arithmetic and reading by the use of puppets and ventriloquists. See, again, it's the source. The person who isn't jealous for God's word and glory and truth, a nominal Christian church member type person, and you find them in charismatic circles too, they always get a little turned off when you make associations. But you see, that's the subtle part about it. That's the way the devil works. He works that way to get the children hooked. And with people, as I say, who want a little more demonstration, then he'll give them some free sex or something to get them into witchcraft. And that'll be the attraction, what goes on there, and then you know the rest of the story. Isaiah 8:19, we're still on the same idea of what an oath means. Isaiah 8:19 speaks of oaths, necromancers, as those who chirp and mutter. Isaiah 8:19. God said, don't consult the oaths who chirp and mutter. Well, you get the picture again. It's the idea of throwing the voice and the peculiar sounds that go on in seances. Isaiah 29:4 suggests the low muttering voice of the medium. Isaiah 29:4 suggests the low muttering voice of the medium. Isaiah 29:4, and thou shalt be brought down, speaking of Jerusalem's judgment, thou shalt be brought down and shalt speak out of the ground, and thy speech shall be low out of the dust, and thy voice shall be as one that hath a familiar spirit. Well, this is the word oath. See, this is the way you study the Bible. You want to know what it means, then go to usage. He says, when I judge you, then you're going to be brought so low, you're going to speak out of the ground like out of a pit, and you'll sound like a medium in a seance. Because you see that hollow sound way down in the pit. Help! Or whatever. Well, the oath appears in many passages. I'll give you a few. Leviticus 19:31, Leviticus 20 verse 6 and 27, Deuteronomy 18:11, 2 Kings 21:6, 2 Kings 23:24, 1 Chronicles 10:13, 2 Chronicles 33:6, 1 Chronicles 10:13, 2 Chronicles 33:6, Isaiah 19:3, plus those other passages we gave you. The oath is quite common, just like today, the medium. It's the medium. The most complete account of what an oath does is in 1 Samuel 28. Again, if you go to usage, you'll see what they do. And there we see that Saul went to the oath, translated witch of Endor, witch and oath. You can see how far apart Hebrew and English came there. Went to the witch of Endor and told her to divine for him and call up whomsoever he asked her to. She's called there a mistress of necromancy. A mistress, a balat ov. She's called the mistress, the possessor of the bottle, literally. Which brings us to what I started to say about the outline, says familiar spirit and inaccurate translation. Well, it is, for the simple reason I don't know where they came up with that any more than where did they come up with screech owl for Lilith. But there is a closer connection, I suppose, familiar spirit to Ov than screech owl to Lilith. The Hebrew is Ov. What is the significance? And all of you have read King James. Over and over you read about a person with a familiar spirit. Don't consult with a person who has a familiar spirit. Have you ever put it all together? Why is it termed that? Well, remember, that's the English translation of a bottle. That is a medium. But the necromancer was not the familiar spirit, and the reason that term is used by King James translators is because the medium, yet today, is possessed with a spirit of divination. And it's a familiar spirit in the sense it's the same spirit that manifests itself at every seance through that particular medium. It's too bad King James didn't tell us all that. But the reason it's translated familiar spirit is because a medium, a trance medium, will have one spirit guide that always comes to him when he goes into trance, or her. And it's familiar in that sense. But it's a spirit of divination, like in Acts 16:16. Now, before we close, what actually happens? What actually happened back in Saul's day, and what actually happens in a seance? The Ov is a trance medium. They don't know what's going on. The demon takes total possession while they're in trance. You can't touch them. One reason the room is dark is because ectoplasm begins to come out of the orifices of the body. Generally, the most heavily would be the obvious one, the sexual regions, which shows the source of these manifestations. But they'll come out of the nose and mouth. This has been photographed many times. Ectoplasm has actually been cut when the demon manifesting permits it. You can't touch it otherwise because ectoplasm is coming out of the medium. And I trust everyone is at least knowledgeable enough to know that this is not fairy tales, because any library you can even get the pictures in seances. Tables floating, ectoplasm coming out of the nostrils around the navel and other places. Any place there's a body opening. Some people see mother there, and they'll rush up and grab mother, and that ectoplasm generally will rush back into the body of the medium and injure them severely or kill them. Because it's their life processes that are coming out that become visible in the dark. And anyway, what happens, a medium goes into a trance, like Edgar Casey, Arthur Ford, both since know it better by now, both deceased. They had what are called spirit guides. Spirit guides. We're talking about familiar spirit, why it's called that. And these are always spirits of alleged deceased persons. When they go into a trance, and this spirit from the other side is always an important personality, possess them and use their vocal cords and give the revelations. When a bereaved wife wants to talk to her deceased husband, she goes to a seance, you see, and there the husband begins to talk to her through the medium's vocal apparatus. Or he may appear and so on. That is, appear to appear. The spirit guides are always some important personage. Napoleon, Cleopatra, famous surgeon, Indian chief. White Cloud is the guide to a well-known medium in England. Mozart, it's always somebody big, you know. And so they act, allegedly, will act as the intermediary between the realm of the living, the person seeking communication with the dead, and the dead person. And so when the medium goes into a trance, then you tell who you want to talk to, and then that guide who's now speaking through the medium, he or she's in a trance, totally knocked out, you see, says they will go and get this person. So the person impersonating White Cloud or Mozart or whoever acts like he goes and gets him. It takes a second or 2 or 5 seconds to get that spirit on the other side. Then the spirit impersonating the guide, like he's White Cloud, then he impersonates the deceased person. And they're masters at, impersonating voices and getting information and all that. Or some other spirit could impersonate that person. Because England is the source of much occultism, and so they understood why they use this term. It's a familiar spirit in the sense that the same spirit of divination that manifests through the medium at each seance. It would have been helpful if they'd have told us that. But we know it to be an ove, a bottle. And the bottle suggests, ventriloquism and all of those things we told you. All right, Lord bless, we'll see you next time.